I'll make a start. So the Dambusters, of course, very famous in period, but became much more famous through the 1955 movie. Now, if your only source of information about the Dambusters raid is the movie, and quite a lot of people seem to fall into that category, then you probably think that the bomb was spherical, because it was made to look spherical in the movie. It actually was cylindrical, as we'll see later on, but in 1955 that was still classified. So the movie makers did have certain restrictions. They couldn't show all the technical details of the bomb, even though, as we'll see later, the Germans actually captured an intact bomb and pretty much worked out how it was operating, and obviously 10 years after the war. So the movie, fantastic film, obviously I'm sure everybody in this room has seen it at least once. It is a movie. There are a few inaccuracies here and there. There's a few things left out, but by and large, an absolutely excellent representation of the epic accomplishment of the Dambusters raid. So let's start here with the Möhne Dam, the mighty Möhne Dam, built and opened by the Kaiser in 1913. So it's 110 years old this year. This dam, together with other dams in the area, controlled the flow of water down into the Ruhr Valley, which was the industrial heartland of Germany, as I'm sure you know. There's a pre-war photograph here. So if we look at it in cross-section, you can see it's a freestanding concrete structure. So in theory, if you can get a bomb in this sort of area, possibly you could breach the dam, and that was obviously the objective. The second major dam was the Sorpe Dam. This, I believe, is one of the photographs that was actually used in the briefing of the pilots. It's a very early picture because the dam's not actually full. This is the water level here. And you can see this earth bank, and there's another bank dropping down the other side. You can't really see it terribly clearly in the picture, so let's look at it again in cross-section. So you've got this concrete core, but piles of gravel, rubble, and quarry waste here, and other banks down this side. So that's a really, really hard thing to destroy. You can think of maybe destroying a concrete dam, but the banked dam, much, much more difficult to destroy. So the third major dam then was the Eder, and it was a freestanding concrete structure quite similar to the Möhne. The Kaiser was due to open the Eder Dam in August 1914, but he found himself otherwise engaged starting the First World War, and he didn't show up to the opening. So the dam capacity, so this is one of the many hydroelectric power stations that sat down below the dams. So the Möhne, 130 million cubic meters of water. The Sorpe, 70 million cubic meters of water. So Sorpe, what we might say nowadays, high risk, high reward. Very difficult thing to destroy, but if you do destroy it, you send 200 million cubic meters of water down the Ruhr Valley. So those two dams controlled 75% of the water in the Ruhr. The Eder Dam was on a separate system. It didn't actually connect with the Ruhr. It's an even bigger reservoir at 200 million cubic meters, and obviously that's why it was selected as a target. Now, the existence of these dams and their proximity to the industrial heartland of Germany made them kind of fairly obvious targets, if you like. And part of the legend, and it's brought across in the movie, that it was Barnes Wallis who thought of attacking the dams. Not strictly true. As early as 1937, committees were set up when war appeared likely to consider targets. And there actually was an air attack on dams committee that looked into ways and means and which dams to attack and how to do it. So as the war then started in 1939, there were ongoing discussions about the dams. Barnes Wallis, as we know, worked out how to do it, but not necessarily the actual attack. On a similar note, the Dambusters raid could actually have happened the other way around, because the Germans were actually interested in attacking our dams. They surveyed the dams in the Peak District with a view to destroying them to disrupt steel production in Sheffield. But they couldn't work out a way to do it because we had Barnes Wallis and they didn't. So, all things being equal, big dam, big reservoir, what's the weapon you would use? How would you attack a dam? Any ideas? Torpedo, correct. Torpedo. This is a ferry Swordfish, which in 1941, torpedo bomber sank the Bismarck. So isn't that what you do? You scale this whole thing up, build a great big torpedo, hang it on the bottom of a Lancaster, drop it into the reservoir, it flies across, blows up the dam. obviously the way to do it. Has the added advantage of not going close to the dam, so it's a standoff weapon. You don't engage out the dam defences. The trouble was the Germans had thought of that too. So this is now a wartime photograph of the Möhne Dam, and here you can see the anti-torpedo nets. So these are heavyweight metal nets placed in front of the dam. So any attack by torpedo, the torpedo would blow up when it hit the nets and would therefore save the dam. Here's a waterside view. I don't think, Ian, you've seen that photograph before. I got that from the German book, showing, again, the anti-torpedo nets. And it sometimes surprises me in accounts of the dam's raid, and even the movie, that the anti-torpedo nets are hardly mentioned. But they're absolutely central to the story. That's the whole raison d'etre of the bouncing bomb. That's why you need it, to get past the torpedo nets. So, as I said, I got that photograph out of a German book, and rather remarkably, according to the caption in that photograph, it was taken on the 16th of May, 1943, the actual morning of the raid, amazingly. Which would be consistent with the dam being quite full. Obviously, that was one of the reasons why they attacked at that stage. It was full. And notice this little gunner here standing up on the top of the tower there, no doubt looking forward to another quiet day on the Möhne Dam. And little does he know what he has in store for him that evening. So they also considered attacks by drones. Now, in case you think I've got the wrong war or the wrong century, even, the history of drones is a lot longer than you actually might think. This is a modified de Havilland Tiger Moth. Normally they were actually used as targets, but they had target practice. They had pneumatic controls on them that were controlled by radio, so they could actually be flown from the ground or by an accompanying aircraft. So as I mentioned, normally they were used for target practice, but the idea was potentially to pack them with explosives, fly them into the dams, suicide drones, just as we see in Ukraine still to this day. Now, the dams aren't that far from the Dutch border, so all the time you're in control of Holland, it's just about feasible to think about a drone attack. But of course, May 1940, the Germans overrun the Low Countries, so that idea is now defunct. As I said, it was based on the de Havilland Tiger Moth, but in the drone, the unmanned version was actually called the de Havilland Queen Bee. And as you know, a male bee is called a drone, and it's believed that that's where the name drone came for unmanned aircraft. So there you go, you've learned something useful this evening. So how do you do it? How do you get past those darn torpedo nets? Well, as we know, enter this man, Barnes Wallis. As we know, he was based mainly at Brooklands before the war, but after attacks in Brooklands, he and his team were moved out to Burr Hill Golf Club for safety, which is where I believe that photograph was taken. Now, what became known as the bouncing bomb was actually Barnes Wallis's Plan B for attacking the dams. Plan A was a giant earthquake bomb, which he said could be dropped in the vicinity of the dam. It would create a kind of an earthquake at the foundations, and the dam would collapse. The trouble was, when he came up with that idea, there was no aircraft big enough to carry the bomb. So he and Vickers came up with a plan for a much bigger aircraft, provisionally called the Victory. Huge thing, bigger than the Lancaster, with 6 engines. The Air Ministry looked at this and said, the huge bomb, the huge aircraft, is still too expensive, too complex, too much. We're not going to do that. So that plan was rejected at that point. Now, in the movie, as I'm sure you know, Barnes Wallis says that he designed the Wellington. He had a big part in designing the Wellington, but the main designer was Rex Pearson. But he was responsible for the geodetic structure of the fuselage, which was famous for absorbing a lot of battle damage. Wellingtons would land with big holes blasted in them, which probably would have taken down other aircraft. I think the cartoon probably slightly exaggerates the point. So a very famous photograph. I'm very pleased we have Elizabeth here with us. She's here in the blue skirt, and she says it was her marbles that he was actually bouncing across this tin can in this famous photograph. I'm not sure whether Elizabeth can tell us or whether we know how he originally got the idea of the bouncing bomb. There's various sort of theories of how the idea came to him. But there was precedent. Back in the days of Nelson's Navy, they did bounce cannonballs across the water to increase their range. So there was actually a precedent in military history. So he went on from this, and again, if you're familiar with the movie, to developing the water tanks, and sufficient support was forthcoming to build and test a prototype spherical bomb, which was filmed down in Dorset. So the spherical bomb became known as Highball, and that was mainly for naval applications to attack shipping, because ships would have torpedo nets around them as well, so you've got the same problem if you want to attack ships in anchor. And in the early stages, the Navy were actually more enthusiastic about the whole concept than were the Air Force. As it turned out, Highball was actually never used in anger, and Highball became a sort of an old story in itself, and Ian here is a bit of an expert on Highball. So approaches then made to Bomber Command and about building a larger dam-busting version of the bomb. Air Chief Marshal Harris, he was unwavering in his belief that the way to win the war was to pulverize German cities and the occupants thereof. He didn't want any diversion of resources from that, as he would see it. But when he heard about the bouncing bomb, he was a big fan. For those of you at the back, this is tripe of the wildest description. There's not the smallest chance of it working. That was a small extract from a longer letter that he wrote to his superiors, and he was very much, in the early days, opposed to the project. And that was as late as February 1943. Now, when you read the detailed books on the dams, and I'll show you some of those later on, there's whole chapters devoted to who supported the project and who didn't, and this committee and that committee. I'm going to sort of cut through all of that and just give a very simple summary. This man was the real father, if you like, in some ways, of the raid, because Sir Charles Portal was the overall head of the RAF, therefore Harris's boss. He interestingly had sat on the aerial attack on dams committee that we talked about a few minutes ago, and he was a believer in the idea of the dams attack. To Harris's annoyance, he was overruled, and Portal said, we're doing it. And he gave the go-ahead to Operation Chastise in late February 1943. Now, it was an incredibly tight timescale. In February 1943, there wasn't even a technical drawing in existence of what would go on to become the upkeep bomb, because Barnes Wallis wasn't authorized to do that. It wasn't an official project. It was just his rough sketches. They wanted to attack in mid-May for two reasons. First of all, as we saw in that photograph, the dam would be very full in mid-May after the winter's rain, and secondly, there was a full moon. So those two factors drove them very much towards the middle of May. In the movie, it sort of suggests that Sir Winston Churchill gave the go-ahead. I think he did know about the bomb and he knew of its potential, but he didn't actually get involved in the operational level of it. So work proceeded, and they had all the dimensions of the Möhne Dam. So in a research establishment in Hertfordshire, they built a 1/50th scale model of the Möhne Dam to test explosives on it. And they discovered something very important, which is that an explosive device actually against touching the dam wall was much more effective than one even a few feet away from it. So the method of delivery had to ensure contact with the actual concrete. So this is another model which still exists, and this photograph was actually taken by Ian, and it's in his Haynes manual. And I think, Ian, it's right, by appointment you can actually go and see it still. Yeah, so it is actually still there. It's a listed building, actually, yeah. But you can actually go to Hertfordshire and see the dam, and you can see with the little sort of practice breach in the middle of it. So they then progressed on up to bigger dams, and this was a disused dam in Wales, and again they did a scale approach here and blew a big hole in the Welsh Dam. I think it's worth mentioning that in the movie it's kind of portrayed that Barnes Wallis did all of this on his own. I mean, he didn't. He had a big team around him. There were designers, draftsmen, engineers. All this crew doing the blowing up of the dams was kind of a little bit separate to what he was doing. So Barnes Wallis obviously worked exceptionally hard on the project, but he didn't work alone. He had a lot of other people working with him. So you then need a crew to fly it. And on the left, we have the very well-known wing commander, Guy Gibson. He was just 24 years old, but he'd flown an incredible 170 operational sorties. Statistically, he should have been killed 3 times. I mean, it's just unbelievable. Nobody else had those kinds of numbers, flying bombers and night fighters. And he was absolutely due a break. He was exhausted, really, and he should have been given a break. But because of his experience and his can-do attitude and his leadership, he was asked to form a 617 squadron at Scampton. He recruited these two pilots. On the left, Dingy Young. Dingy acquired his nickname. He was shot down over water twice and took to the onboard dinghy and was then rescued by the air sea rescue people and acquired that nickname. On the right, we have Henry Maudsley. I've asked a couple of people, how old do you think that guy is? And people are saying 30s, mid-30s, late 30s. He's 21. 21 years old. Maybe that says something about the stress on an individual of flying bomber missions over Germany. And sadly, they were both killed. So 80 years ago this evening, they both gave their lives, both of those pilots, unfortunately. A crew that did return was that of Joe McCarthy, the only American on the raid. This is him in the middle, big Joe McCarthy. He'd volunteered through Canada and had got into the RAF. On his left here is Johnny Johnson. I'm sure many of you know he died towards the end of last year. He was the last living Dambuster. He didn't quite make it to the 80th anniversary. So that's three experienced pilots that I've just mentioned, but it is a bit of a myth of the Dambusters raid that all of the squadron were elite. They simply weren't. Gibson didn't have time to go around all the squadrons in England and say, give me all your best pilots. So there was this core of very experienced and decorated pilots, but there were a number of crew on the mission that actually weren't that experienced at all. There was two pilots actually had flown less than 10 missions in their entire career, so lots of them were not as experienced as the legend suggests. So the Lancaster in Dambuster specifications instantly recognizable by the lack of the mid-upper turret, which all of the rest of them had. It was taken away to improve aerodynamics and reduce weight a little bit. So the gunner from there was redeployed to a forward position. So normally the bomb aimer would have a kind of a joint role aiming the bomb when he had to do that, but also operating this machine gun. So the gunner, he comes forward, he's now operating this machine gun, and the bomb aimer now becomes part of the navigation crew, because as we know, in order to reach the targets, the Lancasters had to fly across Holland and Germany at 100 feet. So an absolute feat of navigation. Lancaster wasn't designed to do that. It was designed to drop bombs from maybe 15,000 feet. So this was a completely new endeavor. But the bomb aimer would call out landmarks to the navigator and to the pilot, and that system evolved when they did their training. So they did low flying all over England, amassed probably about 2,500 hours, and they absolutely loved it. I mean, these are red-blooded young pilots. They were let off the leash. Normally that sort of low flying would have been a court-martial offence, but now they were flying at treetop level and scaring the local population and animals and everything as well. And there were a few sort of complaints came in about these madcap pilots like flying over very noisily over housing estates. Obviously that picture's not at low level, that's quite a high level in the photographs. It doesn't depict it. They were flying a lot lower than that. And part of the legend is that several times Lancasters would land from training with vegetation trailing from the tail wheel, where they'd obviously been literally at treetop height. But there were no serious accidents in training. Certainly no crews were lost. So meanwhile, Barnes Wallis is carrying on with the design of the larger bomb, and possibly with Elizabeth's marble still in his mind, he still thought he had to go spherical. Now, to build a metal spherical bomb of that size was like a huge, complicated, long project. So what they did to shorten that exercise was the bomb inside is cylindrical, but they built this wooden casing around it to create the spherical shape. But it didn't work very well, and they kept dropping them, and the shell kept cracking and smashing open, and I think Barnes Wallis was at his wit's end. But then one day the casing broke, and the cylindrical bomb inside carried on bouncing, and he had a bit of a eureka moment. He realized, we don't need the outer casing, we'll just go cylindrical. So this is the weapon which then emerged, and what actually was it? The phrase, I mean, I've used it myself because we're all familiar with it, bouncing bomb. The crews didn't use that phrase in period. They called it a mine. And even if you see some of the interviews with the crews many, many years later when they're in their 70s, they always call it a mine. They never call it a bouncing bomb. It was a kind of a hybrid weapon, really. So it's 60 inches wide. That's the maximum that could fit into a Lancaster. Heavy old thing as well, 4 tons, of which 3 tons was actually the explosives. So designed by Vickers, cylindrical, as we say, filled with Torpex explosives, and it had 3 hydrostatic pistols. So probably the most accurate way of describing the weapon is a depth charge. Really, that's what it was, a depth charge, albeit delivered in a very unconventional way. And as per the pistols, they were set to detonate at 30 feet. We'll see how that all worked out in a moment. If that detonation didn't go off, then there was a 90-second self-destruct fuse, but that had to be actually set. And we'll see later on how that didn't actually happen on one occasion. So this is an illustration again from Ian's book, demonstrating the airframe and the calipers here that were designed by Vickers to hold the weapon on, the bomb on. There was absolutely terrific cooperation here between Vickers and Avro, almost unique, really. If you think about it, Avro are responsible for the whole airframe, the actual aircraft, but all of this here is designed and built by Vickers. And they're 2 competitive companies. They're both bidding for government contracts for fighters, etc., and bombers, but they put all that to one side, and the great spirit of cooperation in wartime came together to develop this. So this is a hydraulic motor which Vickers actually made for a submarine. They were able to repurpose it and use it to drive the pulley to rotate the bomb, which rotated backwards, which we'll look at in a moment. And these calipers were spring-loaded, so to drop the weapon, the calipers would be released, they would spring out, and the weapon would fall. So this is another view of the same thing. Again, you've got the hydraulic motor here, you've got the belt, sort of fan belt kind of idea, and the calipers here holding onto the weapon. So this would have been Gibson's aircraft. The commander usually had his own initial on the side of it, so that probably would be Gibson's aircraft there. So that's 2 men with their place in history. On the left, Roy Chadwick, who's the designer of the Lancaster, and Gibson on the right. So the 3 parties, Vickers, Avro, and the RAF, all really, as I say, working together very, very effectively. So great picture of the Lancaster dropping an upkeep. It looks a bit odd with this big gaping hole in the bottom of it, but of course they had to remove the bomb bay doors because the upkeep was too big to fit into the bomb bay. So once it had dropped, it had this sort of gap in the bottom of it. These were all inert bombs, by the way. They were all full of concrete, so they weren't exploding any of these. Now, no conventional bomb site would work, but they knew all the distances, and by a process of triangulation, they were able to come up with the famous Dambusters bomb site. So I'm sort of getting ahead of myself in the narrative. That picture obviously depicts the actual raid itself, but the special bomb site was developed, and in the best traditions of Blue Peter, here is one which I prepared. And this is set to the exact dimensions of the Möhne Dam. So if I was 450 yards from the Möhne Dam right now, the 2 towers would be lining up in my bomb site. I would press the button and release the bomb. So I will circulate this around. You can have a little look at that later on. It's made by a chap called Chris King, and believe it or not, if you want your own Dambusters website, simply go on eBay, type in Dambusters website, and Chris King will make one for you. I think he's on the live stream tonight, I hope so. Now, the altimeter wouldn't work either at low levels, so the famous way in which they got to judge the level were the 2 lights. Now, if those of you are familiar with the movie, there's the section when Guy Gibson goes to the theatre. Are you familiar with that? And there's the lights coming down. Okay, that's complete Hollywood. Yeah, that's completely made up. That did not happen at all. It was designed by a series of engineers at Farnborough, the aircraft establishment at Farnborough. It had been used before on submarine hunting aircraft, but didn't work very effectively because there's more sort of choppy water. But on the smoother water of a dam, it was hopefully going to work. There's 2 flaws in that picture. It kind of shows it clearly, but there's 2 flaws. First of all, the lights didn't come down underneath the aircraft, because if they did that, the crew couldn't see them. The lights were way over to the starboard side, significantly down over here. So actually this aircraft's lights would have been over there. And then the navigator could look out the blister on the starboard side of the aircraft and see when the lights came down. And also the objective wasn't to make one pool like that. It was a kind of a figure of 8 to bring the two lights together, and that would indicate the correct depth, height rather. So the crews carry on practicing dropping these inert bombs. This is actually Henry Maudsley, that 21-year-old that we looked at earlier on, flying this aircraft. He flew a bit too low, and the water came up and struck the back of the Lancaster. And if you look at the third picture, then you will see bits falling off it. That was actually the reason why, in due course, the raid went ahead with 19 aircraft and not 20. Because that aircraft couldn't be repaired in time, and that therefore it didn't go in the raid, so they were down to 20. Now, again, if you're familiar with the movie, you may remember the scene where Barnes Wallis realizes that he can't drop the bomb at 150 feet, it's got to come down to 60 feet. And that was a very important meeting with Gibson. So we asked Gibson to come down all the way from Scampton in Lincolnshire to here. And that very important meeting definitely took place here, actually at Brooklands, not at Burr Hill Golf Club. Because, of course, if Gibson had said 60 feet, that's just too low, it's suicidal, we can't do it, that would have been the end of the mission. So Barnes Wallis wanted to have that discussion with him face to face. And, of course, Gibson said, we'll do it. That was the kind of guy that he was. So tests continued. Again, this is quite a famous picture of the bomb now being dropped towards the beach rather than at right angles to the beach. On the left-hand side, this is Barnes Wallis himself standing here, and this is Gibson standing beside him watching a successful test. But the first time the whole thing actually worked, dropping from the right height, spinning, bouncing, doing the whole thing, was actually the 29th of April, 1943. That's the first time they got it to work. And that's only just over a fortnight before the raid. Incredible. So pulling all of that together, let's look at the bombing run. So aircraft flying at 220 miles an hour. You've got the lights converging down here to get your 60 feet. You're spinning the bomb backwards at 500 RPM. It's dropped at about the distance, where's the distance? Oh yeah, here, sorry, 400 to 450 yards from the dam. So this is why the backspin was so important, because it's rotating anti-clockwise as we look at it. If it wasn't rotating at all and it hit the dam wall, it could just bounce off. If it was rotating forward, it could bounce upwards. But because it's rotating backwards, it rolls down the dam face. And then, as per a depth charge, it then explodes at 30 feet under the water. That's where the most likely break point was going to be. So that's an incredibly difficult thing to do at night, under fire, flying an aircraft that wasn't even designed to do anything like that. And of course, the whole crew, the navigator is checking the height, the engineer is in charge of the speed, the pilot obviously aiming the aircraft. Real teamwork and a very, very difficult thing to do. Now, I always find this absolutely incredible, that there was only ever one full... Ian, do you want a drink? I see you're coughing a bit there. There you go. At your service. Yeah, there only ever was one full dress rehearsal of a live upkeep, which is incredible. So it's a fully armed bomb, dropping it at 60 feet, spinning it backwards at 500 RPM, sinks to 30 feet, blows up. Once they did that. And Ian here dug out this film for us, which is an absolutely unique and precious piece of film. This is the only bit of film you'll ever see of an upkeep actually in action. So let's play it. So the bomb's down one bounce, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You see it here? 6. Here it is 7. 7 bounces. Now it's sinking, sinking, sinking. Takes 4 seconds. And up she goes. The water spout goes up to almost 1,000 feet. Should we play that again? Yeah, that's worth seeing again, isn't it? Yeah, yeah. Let's do that a second time. So there we go, first bounce, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, there it goes. You see it here? 7, and now it's sinking down to 30 feet. So it really was only a prototype. I mean, it was just incredible how little testing actually ever took place. So this is a famous Dambusters photograph. It appears in nearly all the books. Gibson, as I said, had flown 170 missions. You didn't get your photograph taken all the time before a mission, but they knew this was historic. You know, they knew if they pulled this thing off, this was going to be one of the most famous air raids of all time, and that the official squadron photographer took this photograph of Gibson on the ladder there and his crew getting on board. So they attacked in 3 waves. So the first 2 waves went off together. The third wave was held back in reserve. So the first wave taking this more southerly route, and the second wave a more northerly route. So about 400 miles from Scampton to the dams. Now, so there were 9 aircraft in the first wave, and the second and third wave had 5 each. So that's your 19 aircraft. So there were a couple of aborts on the second wave, and sadly a number of aircraft were shot down on the way in. So 3 were shot down, and 2 actually hit power cables. And that wasn't well known. That was quite suppressed for many, many years. It certainly wasn't in the movie, that they weren't actually shot down. They hit either power cables or a pylon that brought them down. Remember, they're flying incredibly low and very, very, very dangerous. So several crews killed before they even got to the dams. So obviously no photographs exist, so we have to rely on the imagination of artists. So again, as we were saying earlier, the bomb aimer is lying face down here, calling out canal, railway junction, church spire, whatever it is he sees ahead of him, giving that information to the navigator, who in turn is following on his map with a stopwatch. And then they reach the railway junction, turn to port, whatever. All very carefully planned out, of course. The route was all very meticulously planned back at base. So of the 9, 8 got to the Möhne. So one of the first wave was shot down. So 8 aircraft get to the Möhne Dam. So the approach in, by the standards of what was to come, we'll see in a moment, relatively straightforward, reasonably low-lying land here and low-lying land here, going in for the attack. So Gibson went in first and dropped his bomb. Again, we're relying on artists' impressions. There are no photographs taken or film, obviously. So he probably dropped his bomb a bit short. It exploded in the water, big water spout, but the dam held. He called in 2 more. Similar results, they missed. He called in then the 4th, which was Dinghy Young's bomb, and he dropped his as well. Now, one of the reasons why Gibson got his VC for this raid was he incredibly bravely, this picture doesn't really depict it that accurately, but he flew alongside the other bombers. So he'd already dropped his bomb, but he flew alongside the bombers that had the live bomb to draw the enemy fire, the machine gun fire, onto himself. To give the other bombers a greater chance. So an incredibly brave thing to do. He did that several times when the other aircraft went in and dropped their bombs. So 4 bombs hadn't done it, so he called in the 5th, which is a pilot called David Maltby. Maltby dropped the bomb, and as Maltby came in, he could see the top of the dam crumbling. So it turns out that probably Young's bomb would have done it. If he hadn't dropped his bomb, the dam still would have gone. But he was committed to the bombing run, so he dropped the 5th bomb, direct hit, and the dam was breached. So these are the reconnaissance photographs. And normally aerial reconnaissance pictures are top secret, but this was completely the reverse. This was telegraphed all the way around the world, and of course became an absolutely iconic photograph, probably the most famous photograph, or one of the most famous photographs of the Second World War. And another photograph of the Möhne breach the following day. So millions of cubic litres of water here pouring through the enormous breach in the dam. So 8 aircraft, 5 have now dropped their bombs, so that now leaves 3. So 3 then now proceed to the Möhne Dam, to the Eder Dam, with Gibson still in charge and with Young with him as a second in command. So they're there to oversee the attack by the 3 remaining upkeeps. A very, very difficult approach. That 2-dimensional map doesn't really show it to you, but this picture certainly does. One of the greatest feats of flying of the Second World War, or probably any war, getting down to low level in this narrow valley, coming across the water to this headland, then a very sharp right angle turn to port. The distance from that headline to the dam is 875 meters. And that took them about 10 seconds to do that. 10 seconds to get the height, the speed, keeping the wings level. I didn't mention that, but the wings have to be absolutely level. Everything has to be perfect in those 10 seconds. Otherwise, you're not going to get the bomb onto the dam. So, and also, just to add to it, you can't see it in that picture because it's sort of in front of us, but there's high ground. So as soon as you cross the dam, it's full throttle and up over the hills again. Unbelievable feat of flying. So unsurprisingly, given the difficulty, they had a few abortive runs without dropping the bombs. And it alternated between the three pilots. They were all sort of having a go at it. And then Gibson said, okay, we're going to have to attack now. So first bomb is dropped, doesn't breach the dam. Second bomb is dropped, doesn't breach the dam. So now down to the last upkeep, one more bomb to go, flown by Knight, Pilot Officer Knight, and he scores a direct hit and breaches the Eder Dam, blows this fairly massive hole in it. And again, here is another photograph of the Eder, again the following day, still with the water pouring through. Now, what about the poor old second wave? They're completely ignored in the movie. The movie only concentrates on the Möhne and the Eder, but we've got 5 aircraft in the second wave heading to the Sorpe. Now, 4 out of those 5 were lost, so only 1 out of the 5 actually makes it to the Sorpe Dam. That is McCarthy, the American pilot that we saw a few minutes ago, with Johnny Johnson as his bomb aimer. Now, here the attack is completely different. Instead of a head-on attack, they're flying along the length of the Sorpe Dam. Remember, this is the dam with the big earth banks, yeah? Completely different construction. And in this attack, the bomb didn't bounce and it didn't spin. It was just simply dropped as a depth charge in front of the dam. And part of Dambusters legend is that Johnny Johnson called off the approach 9 times. Everybody familiar with that story? 9 times he said he wasn't happy with the speed or the height of the approach. His crewmates were cursing him, get that damn bomb out of this plane, let's get out of here. But he stubbornly wouldn't agree until they did the 10th pass, and finally he was satisfied that it was right, and he pressed the button and dropped the bomb. Later on, an aircraft from the third wave, they flew over as a reserve, much later than the first 2 waves. Another aircraft from the third wave dropped a bomb on the Sorpe Dam at pretty much the exact same spot. So we see aerial photograph now of the Sorpe, because of that big earth bank construction, very, very difficult to destroy, as we said, but it clearly has been damaged here, and you can see the stain of the water coming down out of the Sorpe, and the water all collecting in the basin down here below. So there was substantial damage done to it, and after this attack, the Germans did reduce the level of water in it because they were worried, maybe there is a crack in it. So, it was a significant part of the raid as well. What's not often known is that a 4th dam was attacked that night. The Napa Dam, another member of the third wave, dropped a bomb at the Napa Dam, but again dropped it too short and didn't actually do any damage. Now, the big mystery of the dam's raid is, where were the night fighters? There certainly were German night fighters in the area. This was the route into the Ruhr, and they would obviously engage high-flying Lancasters on conventional bombing runs. This is a Messerschmitt 110 with that rather ugly but effective air-to-air radar on the front. But the night fighters never appeared. Now, they got to the Möhne Dam at about midnight. They breached the Möhne Dam at about 1 in the morning. They breached the Eder Dam at about 2 in the morning. So for all that time, they were circulating at low speed and would have been extremely vulnerable if the night fighters had got there. Some of the crews reported seeing night fighters high up above them, but they just, for some reason, the communications just didn't work. Nobody told the German night fighters, they're down there, they're down below you. And thank goodness, obviously, that didn't happen because, clearly they would have been exceptionally vulnerable if that had happened. So after the raids, again, the route home was planned out back to Scampton. And to me, one of the saddest stories of the Dambuster raid concerns Dingy Young. his crew here in A Apple. They just crossed the Dutch coast and they're out over the North Sea. You can imagine a certain sense of relief. You know, we're over the sea now, we're kind of on our way home. But the German gunners rotated the guns around, anti-aircraft guns, shot the aircraft over the sea and brought it down. And the whole crew was unfortunately killed. So it was unfortunately third time very unlucky for Dinghy Young. And this is the wreckage of their Lancaster that was washed up on a Dutch beach a few days later. And this then is the memorial there. The night of 16-17 May, Lancaster A-Apple was on a homeward flight from a raid in the German dams to RAF Scampton. The Lancaster was hit by anti-aircraft fire and crashed about 2 kilometres south from this point along the shoreline. All 7 crew members lost their lives and are buried in Bergen Central Cemetery. And there's young DFC and Bar. Now, as the Lancasters were landing back at Scampton, cross-country in Oxfordshire, RAF Benson, the photo reconnaissance Spitfire was taking off. Now, you notice there's no guns on that aircraft. The guns were removed to make it lighter and also to make room for photographic equipment. But, you know, that's pretty dangerous too, flying over German territory in an unarmed aircraft. I mean, the chances are in 1943 the Germans probably didn't have anything quicker than a Spitfire, so you relied on your speed to get out sharpish if you're spotted. But they were brave men too. Oh, yep. So another picture, aerial picture, obviously a couple of days later, maybe one or 2 days later. Anyway, you can see by now the Germans have put up, slightly bolting the door after the horse is gone. They put up these barrage balloons, which would have scuppered the mission, of course. Even if they'd been in place during the attack, the Lancasters couldn't have come in at 60 feet. It would have prevented the attack. But like I said, when you've blown that big a hole in the dam, you're not likely to come back the following night to try to make it bigger, are you? You know. So I think the barrage balloons were a slight waste of effort. So this is below the Eder. Remember, that's not going down to the Ruhr. It's a different valley. So you can see a couple of bridges gone here, land inundated. There are hundreds of photographs of the damage. So again, you're seeing bridges here and other infrastructure being damaged. This photo I actually took from a German website. I'd not seen it previously. It's quite a long downstream. The floods went more than 100 kilometres downstream. This is the Ruhr itself, and you can see these fairly shocked civilians the day after, standing, watching, and obviously picturing all the destruction that's gone on underneath that water and that flood going down the river. So lots and lots of devastation. As I said, there are many more photographs that show that. So the Dambusters raid in raw numbers, 19 aircraft, 2 aborted, 8 failed to return. Only 1 was shot down actually at the dams, that was Hopgood. The rest of them were shot down or crashed either on the way there or the way back. 133 aircrew, 53 killed in action, and 3 prisoners of war. So 1 aircrew actually did survive the crash. He was in the rear turret and it was broken, thrown clear, and he survived that, and 2 managed to bail out. Of course, they didn't know that on the night. Obviously, that only emerged later, so on the night, they thought they'd lost 56. So Gibson's logbook. Here on the 14th of May, full dress rehearsal, by which he means the navigational side. He doesn't mean dropping bombs. He means navigating across England to this lake and Colchester Reservoir. So simulating the flight over Holland and Germany, practicing that navigation technique that we were talking about, completely successful. And that was pretty important, doing that successful dress rehearsal, because that gave them the confidence that they'd be able to set off to Germany and actually find the dams. 16th, attack on Möhne and left us D out. Eder Dam's successful. What more do you need to say? I can't quite read it from this angle, but what does that say? 640. So the total mission for Gibson took 6 hours 40 minutes. So quite a long range, the old Lancaster. And then another laconic entry here, awarded Victoria Cross 23rd of May. Oops. So, okay in the logbook? Yep. I gave this talk down at Goodwood the week before last, and we had a number of pilots from the Aero Club in the audience, and they were fascinated by the logbook. They had to analyse the whole logbook in great detail. So the king, in case anybody's not sure, the grandfather of our current king, rushed up to Scampton to congratulate the crew. And here on the left he's the Dambuster. That's Maltby. It was his bomb, as we said earlier, that brought down the Möhne Dam. And this is, I haven't really mentioned him, but a little bit of an unsung hero. That's Air Vice Marshal Cochrane, who really planned the whole route, all the route across and the raid and everything. So he was instrumental. So after this, the whole of the surviving crew were all brought down to Buckingham Palace. As we said, Gibson got the VC, and every other member of the crew were decorated by the King and Queen. Now, one of the aircraft that hit the power cables and came down, they hadn't activated the self-destruct fuse, so the Germans actually captured an intact upkeep bomb. They defused it, and they then reverse engineered it and produced drawings of it. And Ian will actually tell you that the best drawings of the upkeep are actually the German ones. But as somebody said at Goodwood last week, it's a good point, they had time, hadn't they? You know, they had plenty of time to do it, whereas on our side we were doing the thing in a whole big rush. Now there's one little sort of part of the Dambusters legend, which I hope is true. I think it's true, and I hope it's true. They worked out a lot of how the bomb worked, and also the fact that it spun, but not backspin. They thought it spun forward. Now, why is that? Well, Germans don't play cricket. Unlike the engineers at Vickers, who were party to the dark art of spin bowling, and they knew what forward spin would be. So that's a part of the legend, which I say, I hope that's true. But certainly, Ian will tell you on the drawings that they made was a little arrow showing that the bomb actually rotates forward, not backwards. And of course, as we said earlier, it wouldn't have worked if it rotated forwards. So the German High Command were pretty shocked. James, have you got that book? Are you sitting on it? Sorry, I need that in a second. Albert Speer here was Hitler's armaments minister. He was woken in the early hours of the 17th of May and flown over to see the damage for himself. And he was a pretty smart cookie. He realized there were a number of reasons that they had to be really quick and decisive about getting this thing fixed. First of all, to restore the power and get armaments back up and running down in the Ruhr Valley. But also the propaganda side of things. He realized that the Allies were really milking this one and that they had to sort of try to redress that balance. So he initiated an absolutely massive repair program on the dams. Now, the big frustration of the dams raid, and in Max Hastings' book, he actually has a section that he calls Squandering the Sacrifice, which is maybe a little bit strong language, but why were there no attacks on the repairs? The Germans fully expected that. Speer said he absolutely expected, I don't mean more bouncing bombs, just normal high-level bombing. And most of this is wooden, by the way, so high-level attacks by normal bombs and incendiaries, you could have destroyed the repairs, maybe attacked it another couple of times, keep the dams actually out of the war. But you know, maybe there's an element of hindsight and all of that. At the time, it just didn't seem to occur to them to do follow-up raids and to attack the repairs, which is a heck of a pity, really, because the dams were effectively repaired in about 6 months, and they were ready for the following autumn. So another famous Dambusters photograph. This is Maltby and Gibson in Gibson's office at Scampton. Obviously a little sort of posed photograph for the press. They're looking at pictures of the dams raid. So they both returned from the dams raid, but sadly both were killed later in the war. Neither of them survived the war. And in fact, Gibson's entire crew were killed. Not one of them survived the war. So the impact of the dams raid, so sadly there were about 1,300 deaths, of which 600 were foreign workers. I say workers, i.e. slaves. You'll see often that they were described as being Russians, but in fact a lot of them were Ukrainians, as Ukraine was actually part of USSR in those days, so they had a bit of bad luck, to say the least. Most of those deaths were obviously civilians. There weren't very many military people that were caught and killed in the floods. There were over 10 factories destroyed and 120 damaged. Now, those people that say, well, the Dams raid didn't achieve that much, just look at that statistic on its own. The RAF bombing and accuracy wasn't that great. Obviously, it was improving as the war went on, but you could have squadrons going out to attack a factory, 30, 40 planes, and miss the factory completely. The Dambusters destroyed, I think it was 11 to be precise, factories and 120 damaged. Over 10 power stations out of action, 25 or more road and rail bridges destroyed. 20,000 repair workers were transferred from the Atlantic Wall. When Rommel was given responsibility for the Atlantic Wall later in 1943, he was shocked when he got there to find out how behind they were. And one of the main reasons for that was these 20,000 people were all mixing concrete and carrying bricks and repairing dams. They weren't building gun emplacements on the Normandy beaches, which of course took place a year later. So you can make that link between the Dambusters raid and the and D-Day, which took place a year later, and the Eastern Front as well. Of course, all this resource would be poured into repairing the dams. There was a massive increase in defensive resources. Now, we've talked mainly about 3 dams, but there were a whole series of dams, 9 or 10 dams in the area. And I got this book here when I was in Germany recently, Dambuster Raid, A German View, absolutely fascinating, really recommend it. And there's letters in there from local German politicians. The population was frightened, and understandably, they'd seen the carnage and the flooding and the deaths in the valleys, and they were frightened. Were the Dambusters going to come back again the next night, take down the Napa and other dams? So to quell the panic, if you like, in the population, the Nazi government had to pour in huge defensive resources into the dams. Machine guns, torpedo nets, barrage balloons, smoke machines, mines, you name it, and all these dams in the area to try to placate and to reassure the locals that they were safe from further attack. And again, all of those machine guns and all of that equipment, they're all on the dams. They're not on the Eastern Front, and they're not on the Normandy beaches. So again, I'm making that direct link. About 10,000 acres of arable land was swamped, and Germany, was a country short of natural resources. This was mid-May, all the crops were in the ground, so that in itself was a blow, and animals drowned. There's some horrible pictures of drowned animals, unfortunately. James Holland, one of his researchers, came up with this figure, 756 million Reichsmarks, was the cost of the Ruhr attacks up to May 1943, which in today's money was about £6 billion. So that's a pretty high impact. I think you can agree. So I certainly don't hold with this view that the Dambusters raid didn't really achieve much. But that's just the physical side of things. What about the morale and prestige matters? So Winston Churchill, by coincidence, was in America, and he made a speech in Congress on the 19th of May, talked about the Dambusters raid, had like a standing ovation. It was a terrific morale boost for the Allies. This was when D-Day was being planned, and Britain had really shown its capabilities. It was printed in newspapers all around the world, or all around the Allied world at least. Massive publicity there, big boost to British morale. The Dambusters became very famous. I don't think they bought themselves a pint for the rest of the war once it was known they were in 617 Squadron. They printed leaflets in Dutch and in French. This is in the days before Instagram. This was how you got the message out. You printed leaflets and then you dropped it over the particular territories, again with pictures of the dams broken and giving again a morale boost to people in the occupied territories. The German leadership was severely shaken. I'm going to read you a short section from this book. This is the German book, which, as I said, is absolutely excellent. In fact, Ian, I think it's my second favourite Dambusters book after yours. So this is Goebbels, the propaganda minister for Hitler. The past night has brought very heavy damage in the aerial war. The attack of the British bombers on our reservoirs has experienced great success. The Führer is extraordinarily angry about the lack of preparation on the side of our air forces, i.e. the night fighters. The damage to production can be considered as exceeding the normal. Of course, they brag mightily about the achieved success in London. They exaggerate in a manner which gets on one's nerves, but admittedly they can call upon remarkable successes. So, that's from the horse's mouth. That's Hitler's right-hand man. The German leadership extremely shaken by all of this. And, you don't win wars by one event. You win them by increments, and that certainly played its part. And then afterwards, of course, Wing Commander Gibson did a morale-boosting tour of the VC. So when you look at all of the different benefits that flowed from the Dams raid, I certainly think it was very, very successful. Another success, you could say, was this, because, of course, after the success of the Dams raid, Barnes Wallis's reputation was sky high. So he dusted down his plans for the big earthquake bomb, which of course you've all seen this afternoon, or many of you would have seen over there in the stratosphere. So they developed the Tall Boy and the Grand Slam. They sank the Tirpitz with them. They destroyed other German infrastructure. And again, a lot of that wouldn't have happened if the Dams raid hadn't been successful. That was a direct consequence of that. What isn't well known is there was actually a second Dams raid, not by 617 Squadron, but by 9 Squadron in October 1944. They had a go at the good old Sorpe again, and they dropped, I can never remember if it was Grand Slams or Tall Boys. Can you remember, Ian, which it was Tall Boys they dropped on it? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So they dropped 5 Tall Boys on it, and still the old Sorpe stood. So, yeah, as I said, there was never an attack on the repairs to the other dams, but they had another go at bringing down the Sorpe, so that was never going to be easy. If any of you are technically minded, and obviously we discussed this at Goodwood last week, a Microsoft Flight Simulator, you can fly the whole mission. You can take the two routes across, the northerly route, the southerly route, all the way down to the dams. When you get there, you can fly in the bombing run. This is actually the Eder Dam. Remember I mentioned earlier the high ground behind. It wasn't just the approach, it was getting past it, which was a very terrific challenge as well. So I don't know too much about that, but it looks like a lot of fun. I think I'll do that. So there's 3 main books on the Dambusters raid. Sweetman's book's supposed to be the most authoritative. I would say it's a bit heavy going in places, to be honest with you. The Hastings book is very good, but I would say the best one, the easiest one to read is the James Holland book, really, really excellent. So you can simulate the raid, you can read books about the raid, but the best thing that you can do is to go there. And the week before last, I did a trip to the dams in Germany. It was absolutely fantastic. I absolutely loved it. This is the Möhne Dam as it is today. What an incredibly atmospheric place, this huge brooding presence of the dam and all of its history. There's a little memorial garden over on this side of the dam, but as you can see, the repairs aren't really very visible there. Obviously, 80 years of weathering has covered up the repairs to the dam. But yes, it really is a wow moment when you first see the Möhne Dam in the concrete. So 80 years ago this evening, the bomb site was being lined up on the Möhne Dam, so I thought I would have a little go from the riverbank, and there I am using the famous bomb site. We then drove down to the Eder Dam, which is further away than I thought. Actually, it's an hour and a half's drive. It's quicker by Lancaster, obviously, but again, another navigation feat to actually find it, because it's lots of little fingers to the dam and everything. The reservoir is quite complicated, but there again, I am lining up the bomb site on the towers of the dam. So in contrast with the Möhne Dam, the repairs at Eder were very visible. That's the exact spot there where the hole was actually breached. And I don't know, must have used some slightly different concrete or something, but you can see the repairs very clearly. Now, there is a museum at the Eder Dam. Some people think it's a bit odd that the Germans have a Dambusters museum, but they do. It's not a state museum, it's very much a private museum run by this very engaging German chap. I booked him onto the live stream, so I hope he is watching this evening. And he's built this little diorama of the Eder Dam. Obviously, this line here showing the breach. We've got a little upkeep here above it and a couple of Lancasters flying over it. He's the most unbelievable Anglophile. He has photographs of the royal family up. And when we were there, he was so excited about the coronation You wouldn't believe it. So he's possibly a little bit on the eccentric side, but an excellent chap. So when you do your trip to the Möhne Dam, which I highly recommend, or the Eder Dam rather, I should say, go and see his museum for definite. So we're back to the Möhne Dam, and this was certainly quite a spine-tingling moment. I'm standing on the Möhne Dam on my own, actually on the impact point in dusk. So I'm going to hopefully play you a little video. Played up slightly earlier. So you imagine the Lancasters forming here, coming at you here, dropping the bomb, bounce, 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 sinking, and then blowing up just beneath my feet. So that was at dusk. So later on that evening, I was very lucky. I was able to take what you might call almost the sort of the ultimate contemporary Dambusters photograph. Standing on the impact point in a full moon. So when you do your dams trip, make sure it's a full moon. It was complete coincidence, but we didn't plan it at all. It was just pure chance that it happened to be a full moon when we were there. But yeah, that really was spine-tingling, standing there again on the impact point, imagining the Lancasters just literally flying down that line of moonlight. Absolutely incredible. So I've got lots more photographs of the trip, but I think that's probably enough. So Ian, would you like to come up and join me? And do we have, you need to switch that on, yeah. So do we have any questions about the raid? So Neil, we'll need you or someone else to run around with the, James, do you want to do it? James, will you do the microphone?
I'm happy to do it.
You have to do it, okay.
Can I ask a question myself?
Is mic on?
Can I just go, when you explained that the aircraft went into pylons and power lines and some were downed, why didn't they fly at 15,000 feet and then drop to the proper altitude closer to the dam?
I suppose that's the $64,000 question.
It's because of radar.
Yeah, technically they didn't need to fly that low all the way in. If they'd flown even at 300 feet, then they would have avoided. They probably had more flak attacking them, but they didn't actually need to be quite that low, I suppose.
Thank you.
They did know about the pylons. They knew where most of the electricity lines were, but yeah, it's difficult to see them in the moonlight.
Right, questions? Can you put your
Yeah, there was a
hand up?
question about halfway down there, Neil.
Got one here on the right.
Hello. Going back to the highball, which you said they trialed it and then they'd never used it. So I've got sort of two questions really, which is one, well, why didn't they ever use it if it was designed for ships? And also, did they ever have a go at live firing it? Did they ever drop one? You said there was one prototype of the upkeep that went bang. Did they ever do that with the highball?
The main thing they wanted to do with highball was to sink the turpets. So the plan was to put a couple of highballs on the Mosquitoes, base them in northern Scotland, fly up to Norway where the turpets was in the fjords, fly up the fjord and sink it. Very inconveniently, the Germans parked the ship in a very steep valley end on. So it was actually physically impossible to actually drop the highball against the turpets just because of the way the ship was positioned in the fjord. The squadron was based, 618 squadron was based in the north of Scotland for a while, hoping that they might just move it a bit and they could have a go at it. And there is some evidence that they were given clearance to use the highball partly as in practice doing sweeps in the North Sea and up sort of past Orkney and Shetland looking for U-boats, and they were given clearance to drop high balls. And very shortly after that, I think within a couple of weeks, somebody vetoed that because A, they didn't want to give the secret away if a U-boat happened to survive, and also a U-boat's incredibly low in the water, so you would be lucky to actually hit it with a bouncing bomb. It would probably skip over it, so the people in the conning tower would see what was happening and you'd lose the secret. So It is possible that live weapons were actually carried on some anti-submarine sweeps, but they were never actually used.
Okay, another question?
Yes, before I ask my question, I've heard the cricketing story as well, and it was said that the dams were breached by a googly. So,
Yeah.
But just sort of following on really from, I think, the last question, which my question was, was there any thought of reusing the technology, or was it simply a complete one-off?
They did have some ideas to use other, use upkeep again. There was a dam in the north of Finland which was used, I think they were doing nickel mining in the north of Finland, and there was a dam there that they were quite interested in. There were several targets in Italy that were looked at, and there was one in, was it France or Switzerland? Somewhere near the France-Switzerland border. And what they wanted to wash away the railway that ran between France and Italy. And the idea was to breach this dam, which was in a hanging valley. And that one got stopped because immediately below the hanging valley where the dam was, there was a village. So if they had actually breached that dam, the entire contents of the reservoir would have swept the railway away, but they would have swept that whole village away as well. So that never happened. But they were actively looking at attacking other dams that just didn't happen. They also looked at the Erft Dam, which was another walled dam in Germany. They did eventually attack that with tall boys as well, although it was damaged, but it wasn't breached.
Thank you. Got another one here.
Oh, he's right down at the back, so come back up.
Just a comment. In George Edwards' book, he actually says it was his idea to do the backspin.
Yeah.
However, the question is, why did they attack the Sorpe Dam when they knew the bomb wouldn't work on that dam?
It was really because the Sorpe was the next most important dam after the Möhne. So if they got the Möhne and the Sorpe together, that would have really deprived the whole Ruhr of the water. Wallis knew it probably wouldn't work. Probably the high bods at the Air Ministry guessed it probably wouldn't work either. What they were hoping was that it would crack the concrete core of the dam, and then water would sort of leak through. And if they could get a leak going, then eventually, because of the construction, the dam would actually wash away, which had happened before and has happened since, actually. Dams of that construction have actually started to leak and then have ended up washing themselves away. I think Gibson wrote to Wallis shortly after the raid, and one of the lines that he has is, "Still waiting for the Sorpe," just hoping that it's cracked and there is some water leaking through, and eventually it'll wash it away, but it didn't happen, unfortunately.
There was one over here somewhere.
Neil, just forward there, the second row.
Thank you. Excuse my ignorance, but I'm really confused by the bomb, and I always have been, because it's how, why did it blow up? Why did it detonate when it detonated? I mean, I can remember watching the film, and every time it bounced, kind of like pulling a cushion over my head, thinking it's going to blow up now. And then it bounces 7 times, then it drops, then it hits the dam, then it goes up. Did they detonate it on the plane and it was timed, or how did that work?
Oh, it's depth charge.
Yeah, so it was almost a conventional depth charge. So it's a cylinder full of explosives, and then it had 3 tube-like things inside it, which were what are called depth charge pistols. And what happened was, as the bomb sank, they filled with water, and there was a bellows inside, and the water pressure pushed it apart. And then when it got to a certain point, it released a spring, which fired the detonator, which then set it off. And they had 3 of them just in case one of them didn't work. The depth charge pistols were exceptionally robust against damage, because if you see pictures of depth charges on naval ships, they're actually firing them off the back of the ship, so that you fire one that way and you fire one the other way to try and catch the submarine, so they could be fired with very high G forces and the pistols were not affected.
So I put the diagram back up. So those are the three pistols there inside. So one of the reasons why they didn't test it very much was, as Ian says, they've been dropping depth charges like since before the First World War. It was known technology that these things would work and they would blow up at 30 feet.
I suppose it's the irony that the upkeep is actually very simple. It's just a steel cylinder full of explosives with some depth charge pistols in it. And Grand Slam and Tall Boy, which were also very successful, are really just big bombs. That's all they were. They were a particular shape. They were carefully manufactured to that particular shape, but ultimately they were just big bombs. And Tall Boy and Grand Slam are actually one of the very few inventions of Wallis which he didn't patent. Everything he did was profuse patenter. He produced 5 or 6 patents a year on average. Even the Dams bomb was patented in 1942, even though it wasn't made public until the 60s. So he was patenting everything, even this.
Okay. Any other questions?
Yep,
one on the front here.
Thanks, Neil. Firstly, thank you for a most enlightening presentation. Always been curious, what happened to the surviving aircraft? Were they modified to carry Tall Boys and Grand Slams, or were they scrapped?
The history is a little bit confusing, but essentially most of them were converted back to, or they had the upkeep mechanism removed. Some of them flew with normal bombs on, I think, the Moor raid, where the first time they used the Tall Boys. Some of the planes, they were also attacking a bridge, and 2 or 3 of the Dambusters, Lancasters, flew on that raid just carrying bombs, ordinary bombs. Some of them were kept in the same configuration because later in the war and after the war, the upkeeps themselves had started to deteriorate, so they had to dispose of them. So they loaded them into the remaining planes and dumped them in the sea, flew out to sea and just dropped them into the sea to get rid of them. So they were still in existence. Those ones, my next research task is to find out exactly what happened to them. The rumor is, because they were stored at RAF Lossiemouth, I believe, that there is a hill somewhere near RAF Lossiemouth, and underneath the hill there is the remains of the Lancasters. There was also there's a town called Kinross in Fife, and there's a rumour that a number of Lancasters and other surplus aircraft were taken there and buried under the ground there as well. That's still a rumour at the moment. I need to go and prove that one. But yeah, if you see me up in Lossiemouth with a JCB sometime in the future, that's what I'll be doing. And I'll answer some questions that we don't know the answer to at the moment.
Okay. Any other questions? Oh, one just down there. Now, should we wrap up then? Did we do a raffle? Yeah. Yeah.
Just a bit about the Lancaster aircraft. When you said they took the top gun turret out, I always thought that was because the fuzz was so weakened by taking away so much to carry that, because they took the bomb doors off. Is there any truth in that it was to strengthen the fuzz?
To strengthen the
fuzz, the fuselage?
No, because the fitting for the turret was still there. They just took the turret out of the fitting and then put a plate over it, which I think was they put some tape around it just to smooth it in. The removal of the bomb doors didn't form any part of the structure of the aircraft. There was a box section in the Lancaster that formed the roof of the bomb bay, so the strength was all in that box, so they didn't lose any of the strength in the aircraft by taking the bomb doors off.
Thank you.
Yeah, I told you Ian knows all the technical stuff. Any other questions? There's one right at the back. Neil, if you're feeling fit.
Yeah, whereabouts? I've got it. See.
Somebody's lining the site up on me at the moment.
I guess an obvious question, really. I think about you mentioned about the night fighters. I'm just fascinated. They went to all this trouble to put the bombers over the dams. Did they have any strategies at all? What were their thoughts about the night fighters being there? And you kind of implied that they didn't turn up, but surely the RAF had some plans about what they would do when they did.
You want to take that one, or?
Well, they were just going to fight their way out. You know, they didn't have the upper turret, so they had less armaments than a normal Lancaster. But you know, it was just part of the danger that you know, they had to take on board. And you know, everybody knew that it wasn't exactly, you know, a potential suicide mission, but they certainly knew it was exceedingly dangerous. And yeah, they just would have fought their way out if the night fighters had attacked. But certainly there would have been losses. Okay, one just here. Maybe should we wrap up then? Just this question up here. That's Ben.
Yeah, there's another one that's just occurred to me. Did they fly so low on the way back as well to avoid the night fighters on the way back, or did they climb up and go?
No, they stayed low all the way back as well, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it was Neil that started that bull rolling. I mean, because of the curvature of the Earth, radar always misses the bottom 100 feet, isn't that right? Roughly. So if you stay under 100 feet, the radar's going over the top of you because of the curvature, and it can't get you. So that's why they sat low to stay under the German. Because it's a little bit like the Battle of Britain in reverse. You know, just as we had the radar to detect the incoming bombers, the Germans had it later in the war to detect our raids going in.
One here from Mr. Jerry.
Harry, I'd like to thank you and Ian tremendously for such an informative chat that we've had this evening.
Thank you.
With everything that's been written and said, we've still learnt a lot more tonight, and it's been informative for us all. And I imagine also for the Barnes Wallis family here in the front row as well, that they have equally really enjoyed it. And what's also so fascinating is that there are still so many rumours left unanswered. And that is quite extraordinary. Who was it who backspun bowling at cricket? Was it Sir George Edwards? Was it the other person as suggested earlier on? We shall never know. Is it true that in the Red Hill Road, in the experimental factory, when they were testing the release mechanism for the bomb, that the bomb left its cradle at 500 RPM, bounced through the factory wall and bounced down the Red Hill Road? Is that true?
Have you heard that one?
We shall never know which rumours are true and which aren't. But what you've done is to so enthuse and interest us in one probably the most exciting lectures so far this year, not probably the most exciting. And what a fitting way to start the opening of our exhibition, for which we have to thank all the Brooklands members for their contributions. And it's just been absolutely stunning. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. So thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you.